The story of the boldest air merchant in New York at the turn of the 20th century. How a native son with Irish roots turned tourists' dreams and immigrants' hopes into profit, selling the Brooklyn Bridge and other American landmarks until the law, and his luck, finally ran out. Imagine the scene. Dawn rises over New York Harbor. The sea mist rolls like smoke, and hundreds of immigrants crowd the deck of a ship, clutching their luggage and their hope. In front of them towers a forest of chimneys, cranes, and masts. Between them stands a copper figure lifting a torch, the Statue of Liberty. For those weary travelers, this isn't just a monument, it's proof that the impossible might actually exist. The year is 1886. New York is an open wound stitched with ambition. The streets smell of coal and sea salt. Newspaper boys shout headlines about inventions, stock crashes, and the latest boxing champions. Everything seems for sale: land, labor, and even luck. Among the voices on the docks, one stands out, calm, confident, speaking the kind of English that sounds official. "Gentlemen, opportunity waits for no man. Would you like to own something truly American?" The newcomer barely understands him, but the word own catches the ear. A handshake later, the man is told he can buy a piece of the Brooklyn Bridge. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. But in 1880s America, absurdity was often mistaken for opportunity. To understand how a man could sell a national landmark, you have to understand the fever of that age. The Brooklyn Bridge had just been completed, the tallest, longest suspension bridge in the world. It was hailed as proof that God favored progress. Tourists came from across the country just to walk across it. At the same time, Ellis Island processed nearly 12 million immigrants. Most arrived with no English, no legal knowledge, and barely enough money to rent a room. They stepped into a city that seemed half dream, half trap. Real estate booms created overnight millionaires and overnight ruins. Newspapers advertised phantom companies and gold mines that existed only in print. Men sold swampland in Florida, shares in underground railways that were never built, even stars in the sky registered under fake certificates. This was an age that worshipped confidence, and from that word, confidence, came a new kind of professional, the con man. He didn't steal through force. He borrowed your belief and never gave it back. Among these early illusionists, one name rose above the rest: George C. Parker. Parker was born on March 16, 1860, in New York City, the son of Irish immigrants who arrived with little more than stubborn optimism. His father worked at the docks, his mother took laundry for sailors. The family lived in a tenement that shook whenever the elevated train passed. George grew up watching how men negotiated survival, loud, confident, always exaggerating their success. He learned that certainty was a kind of armor. By 14, he was selling newspapers. By 16, he was lying about his age to get small clerical jobs. People said he had a politician's voice, steady, persuasive, slightly musical. In his teens, he began testing that voice on street corners, selling fake tickets to theater premieres, shares in non-existent shipping companies, anything that required paperwork and charm. What set him apart was restraint. He never begged, never threatened, never bragged. He simply suggested. People filled in the rest themselves. Never sell the thing, he would later tell another swindler, sell the reason they need it. At the turn of the century, Manhattan was more stage than city. The skyline itself was theater, bridges, ferries, towers, all symbols of upward motion. In a society obsessed with self-reinvention, deceit looked almost respectable. The man who changed his name to sound wealthier was applauded. The clerk who claimed to be a broker might become one tomorrow. Identity was fluid, and Parker understood that better than most. He studied the habits of the powerful. He mimicked their posture, their speech, their patience. By his mid-20s, he looked like any young entrepreneur, clean-shaven, modest suit, confident eyes. He could have sold real businesses, and perhaps he would have, if not for one revelation: pretending was easier and paid faster. Using cheap printing presses, he produced ornate deeds and certificates. For a few dollars, he could buy embossed seals identical to those of the city clerk. Soon, he had an entire suitcase of official-looking documents. But Parker's real product wasn't paper, it was persuasion. He learned to read a man's hopes within seconds: the calloused hands of a laborer who wanted dignity, the nervous glance of a shopkeeper dreaming of expansion, the quiet hunger of a new immigrant desperate for legitimacy. To each, he offered the same priceless commodity, a shortcut to respectability. One evening, as the story goes, Parker sat at a tavern watching a group of dock workers argue about who owned the new bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn. One insisted it was private, another claimed it belonged to the city. That was the spark. If even locals weren't sure who owned it, who could prove he didn't? He began sketching a plan on a napkin: deed of transfer, Brooklyn Bridge, rights to operate toll booths. He realized the beauty of the scheme. The bigger the object, the harder it was to question ownership. The next week, he tested the idea on an Italian fruit vendor who dreamed of becoming a businessman. Parker offered him the exclusive right to collect tolls on the bridge for a modest investment. The vendor hesitated. Parker produced a portfolio of blueprints and city seals. He spoke of bureaucratic delays, of city debts, of the need for private management. His tone was patient, fatherly. An hour later, the man handed over his savings. The following morning, he arrived at the bridge with a hammer, nails, and a freshly painted sign: "Toll, crossing 5 cents." Within minutes, 2 policemen removed him. It was the first of many such scenes that would play out over the next 30 years. From that day, Parker refined his technique. He rented small offices, hired clerks by the day, and printed letterheads reading "Brooklyn Bridge Company Ltd." On the wall hung framed certificates and maps. He even staged meetings where fake city inspectors confirmed the legality of his offer. He learned that his victims didn't want mystery, they wanted process: forms, contracts, signatures. The more bureaucracy, the more believable. Each sale followed a rhythm: casual conversation, gentle persuasion, a glimpse of exclusivity, a handshake, a signature, cash. Within weeks, the bridge had changed hands dozens of times, at least on paper. But Parker wasn't greedy. He often took small payments, knowing that more modest dreams lasted longer. He preferred many small believers to one rich skeptic, and his believers multiplied. The illusion expands. Success bred ambition. Soon Parker was selling more than the bridge. He sold the Statue of Liberty, claiming the government owed him for the pedestal, and he was liquidating the asset. He sold Madison Square Garden, pretending to be a partner of the owner. He sold Grant's tomb, introducing himself as General Grant's nephew. Each scheme had its own costume and accent. To some, he was a businessman, to others, a city engineer. He kept a trunk of props: glasses, canes, pocket watches, visiting cards. To a new immigrant, these details weren't luxury, they were credibility. When he wasn't selling monuments, he mingled with the city's other grifters: card sharps, counterfeiters, crooked landlords. They called him the dream merchant. Unlike others, he avoided violence or drink. His only addiction was persuasion. What made Parker nearly unstoppable wasn't his cunning, it was his empathy. He genuinely understood his victims' desires. He mirrored their speech, echoed their fears, and promised what they already wanted to hear. He knew that every human transaction begins with a simple emotion: trust. And trust, once offered, blinds us to absurdity. Later psychologists would call this confirmation bias, the instinct to protect a belief once it's formed. Parker had discovered it a century early. He often said, "I never fooled anyone. I just gave them a chance to fool themselves." By the late 1890s, Parker had built an invisible empire of illusions. His scams stretched from Manhattan to Boston. Newspapers occasionally reported bridge owners arrested for toll collecting, but the articles were treated as comic relief, not evidence of a mastermind. To the public, these were isolated accidents. To Parker, they were trophies. He walked through the city with the serenity of a man untouchable, tipping his hat to policemen who didn't know they were chasing him. New York, in all its chaos and faith, had become his stage, and he, its quiet playwright. By the mid-1890s, George C. Parker was no longer just a con man. He was an institution. In a city that thrived on spectacle, he had become invisible, the perfect disguise. No headlines, no wanted posters, no angry mobs. Only a trail of owners left clutching their worthless deeds. He worked out of small offices scattered across Manhattan, each rented for a week or a month under a new name. Some days he was Mr. Taylor, the investment broker. Other days, James O'Brien, the city contractor. Sometimes Warden Kennedy, a man representing the Bridge Commission. He'd rent a clerk for the day, someone to answer phones and stamp papers. He even installed a brass plate by the door that read, "Brooklyn Bridge Co. Ltd." Inside, the illusion was complete. Maps of the East River, blueprints pinned to the wall, typewritten letters with embossed seals. A curious visitor would find Parker behind a mahogany desk, half-moon glasses perched on his nose, reading the morning paper, as if the mayor might drop by any minute. One cold morning in 1897, Parker met a man named Giovanni Rossi, recently arrived from Naples. Giovanni had been a mason. He dreamed of owning a business, anything that would prove to his family back home that America was worth it. Parker greeted him warmly. "You work hard, Mr. Rossi?" "Sigh, very hard." "And you want to be your own master?" "Of course." Parker leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's an opportunity I can extend to only one investor. The city intends to privatize the Brooklyn Bridge tolls. I'm authorized to transfer operational rights. It's a small investment, but the return, I assure you, is magnificent." Rossi stared at the papers, thick parchment with ribbons and red wax. "How much?" $500. A fortune? Perhaps, but in 2 weeks, you'll make it back in tolls." Rossi hesitated, then handed over a leather pouch filled with savings. Parker gave him a receipt, shook his hand, and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Rossi. You're now part of New York." 2 days later, Rossi arrived at the bridge with carpenters and boards, ready to build a toll booth. When police stopped him, he proudly unfolded his documents. The sergeant looked once, sighed, and said, "Buddy, you've been sold the Brooklyn Bridge." That phrase, born from his humiliation, would echo for a century. Parker perfected efficiency long before corporate America. He categorized potential clients. Type A, the ambitious immigrant, newcomers with some savings, eager to own something tangible. Type B, the educated optimist, journalists, teachers, small shopkeepers, flattered by exclusivity. Type C, the speculator, people chasing easy profit, often already dabbling in shady ventures. For each, he adjusted tone and presentation. To the immigrant, he was patient and paternal. To the educated man, he quoted municipal law. To the speculator, he whispered about insider deals. His prices ranged from $50,000 to $50,000, always negotiable, always below market value. Sometimes he even offered installment plans, collecting monthly payments from victims who never realized their property didn't exist. The beauty of his enterprise was scalability. You could sell the same bridge twice a week and never run out of buyers. The ships kept coming. When curiosity about the bridge grew too public, Parker diversified his portfolio. He leased advertising rights on the Statue of Liberty's pedestal, claiming the government wanted to fund its upkeep. He sold naming rights to Madison Square Garden, shares in the Metropolitan Museum, even the management of Grant's tomb. He could stand before any landmark and spin a story convincing enough to extract cash on the spot. Each new con required research. He'd study newspaper clippings, memorize the names of architects and donors, and drop them casually into conversation. To his victims, the precision was proof. To Parker, it was theater. He kept a logbook not of names but of scripts, lines that worked, gestures that landed, expressions that built rapport. He was part salesman, part actor, part sociologist. Why did it work for so long? Because Parker understood that deception is a partnership. The con man provides the frame, the victim paints the picture. He exploited 5 universal instincts: authority by dressing like a banker, scarcity by insisting the offer was limited, social proof by mentioning non-existent investors, commitment by asking for small deposits first, hope by presenting risk as courage. People weren't stupid, they were emotional. They wanted to belong to the story of America, to own a piece of it. And Parker gave them that feeling, even if only for a day. In an age before telephones were common, before centralized registries, a forged seal was reality. His genius wasn't forgery, it was timing. He struck precisely when belief outweighed doubt. New York's underworld was a hierarchy, and Parker sat near its top. Pickpockets ruled the Bowery, card sharks prowled the saloons, counterfeiters printed dreams in basements. But Parker was different. He looked respectable enough to dine at Delmonico's and discreet enough to vanish into the subway crowd. Other grifters called him the gentleman. He despised the word criminal. He preferred opportunist. He never carried a weapon, never raised his voice, never stole from the desperate. At least, that's what he told himself. His evenings were spent in hotel bars, observing people, collecting accents and mannerisms. He was building a repertoire, not of crimes, but of characters. Sometimes he bragged quietly to fellow hustlers, "I could sell the moon if I could print a deed." The newspapers rarely named him, but the aftermath of his deals appeared everywhere. A Polish tailor tried to install a turnstile at the bridge and nearly fainted when police intervened. A German brewer paid for rights to run beer concessions on Liberty Island and shipped barrels that rotted at the docks. A Jewish watchmaker bought a stake in the Metropolitan Museum and displayed his deed behind the counter until a journalist exposed it as a fake. Each story added another brick to the myth. Parker followed the coverage with amusement. Free advertising, he called it. The city began to warn newcomers, "Do not buy public buildings." Ellis Island officials even printed pamphlets explaining that landmarks were government property. But warnings can't compete with charisma. By the late 1890s, photography and telegraphs made anonymity harder. Detectives began compiling criminal files. City clerks compared signatures. Parker found himself questioned more often, sometimes detained for a night or two. Each time he slipped away. Witnesses disappeared. Victims left town. Evidence evaporated. He treated arrests as occupational hazards. "I pay rent to the city," he once joked. "Sometimes the rent's just a fine." Still, the atmosphere changed. He felt the city growing less innocent, less naive. New York was learning to doubt, and doubt, for a con man, is poison. Yet Parker couldn't stop. By then, the deception defined him. The rush of persuasion was stronger than the fear of prison. He'd built an empire of illusions, and like any empire, it needed constant conquest to survive. Those who met him late in his career noticed something new in his demeanor, a faint melancholy. He still smiled, still played the gentleman, but his stories lingered longer, as if rehearsed for himself. Perhaps he realized that his greatest victim was his own belief, that he could outtalk fate forever. In the mythology of swindlers, greed usually destroys. For Parker, it was faith. Faith in the art of persuasion, faith that charm could rewrite truth, and for 3 decades it almost did. By the turn of the 20th century, New York had begun to outgrow its innocence. Telegraphs hummed, newspapers competed for sensational stories, and the city that once believed everything started learning to question. For George C. Parker, the air itself seemed to harden. He was still on the streets, still smiling, but the eyes that once saw opportunity now noticed suspicion. Clerks double-checked signatures, immigrants compared notes. Even police officers who once laughed at his name began to watch. He had built a kingdom of paper. Bureaucracy was about to set it on fire. The first serious blow came around 1899, when Parker was arrested for selling investment parcels along the Bowery that didn't exist. He served a few months, charmed his way through court, and returned to business almost immediately. But his record now carried weight. The smooth gentleman had a file, and that file followed him. In 1903, detectives linked him to forged deeds for city property in Brooklyn. Again, he slipped free. A witness forgot, a document vanished, a juror smiled, but he could feel the walls narrowing. By 1908, the police knew his methods too well. They watched the docks for the polished man offering exclusive city contracts. When they finally caught him, Parker accepted it with theatrical calm. As he was led away, he reportedly told the officer, "Don't worry, I'll sign the bridge back over when I return." Jail didn't suit him. It was too small for a man whose crimes stretched from river to river. So one morning, Parker simply walked out. He found a sheriff's hat and coat left unattended on a chair, put them on, and strode toward the gate. The guards nodded. He nodded back. That was all. No tunnels, no violence, no chase, just confidence. The same weapon that had built his fortune. When reporters later asked how he managed it, he shrugged. Everyone believes a man in uniform, especially if he believes it himself. For weeks he was free, drifting through cheap hotels and ferry stations, reading articles about his own escape. They called him the bridge seller. He called it publicity. Eventually, they caught him in Jersey City. He smiled for the cameras, a faint, amused smile that seemed to say, "You're part of the story now, too." The following decade eroded him. The city he had manipulated was modernizing. Telephones replaced letters. Photographs fixed faces that once vanished into crowds. A man who lived on reputation could no longer reinvent himself overnight. He tried smaller schemes, fake checks, counterfeit stocks, bogus inheritances. None carried the thrill of the bridge. By the early 1920s, he was a relic, drifting from boarding house to boarding house. Old acquaintances avoided him. Young hustlers treated him like folklore. And then came the final mistake, a forged check for $150. Barely enough to matter, yet it sealed his fate. In 1926, New York passed the Bombs Law, a harsh measure declaring that anyone convicted of a fourth felony would be sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 years later, Parker became its perfect example. The trial was brief. He was tired, gray-haired, and oddly polite. The prosecutor read the list of prior convictions: fraud, forgery, impersonation, theft by deception. The judge, Alonzo McLaughlin, said quietly, "For years you sold what belonged to everyone. Now you belong to the state." When the bailiff asked if he had anything to say, Parker looked around the courtroom, at the reporters, the officers, the curious spectators, and smiled. "I suppose," he said, "I should have charged more for the bridge." Laughter rippled through the room. It was the last time his voice was heard in public. Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York. Gray walls, iron doors, the smell of river fog. This was where the city stored its ghosts. Parker arrived in the spring of 1928. He was 68, still proud, still neatly dressed. Other inmates, used to violent men, found him peculiar. A gentleman who spoke like a banker, told stories like a playwright, and never cursed. At night, he entertained them with tales of his glory days. "Have you ever seen the face of a man who thought he owned a bridge?" he'd ask, and laughter would roll down the corridor. He became the prison's unofficial storyteller. Even guards paused to listen. They said he could make you forget the bars for a few minutes. But behind the humor lived fatigue. He rarely wrote letters. No family ever visited. The world outside moved on, leaving him trapped between myth and memory. In 1936, or perhaps 1937, the record isn't clear, George C. Parker died quietly in his cell. The logbook listed him as deceased, no remarks, no relatives notified. His body was buried in the prison cemetery under a small stone marked only with a number. He sold it so many times that the bridge itself became a metaphor. Even after his death, the story refused to die. Reporters reused it whenever a new fraud surfaced. Comedians turned it into a punchline. Writers, from pulp to modern essayists, cited him as proof that America's optimism could border on delusion. The phrase, "If you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you," entered everyday speech, a linguistic monument taller than the one he exploited. And perhaps that's the irony. The man who sold symbols became one himself. Parker's genius lay not in greed, but in empathy. He understood what people wanted most, to be seen as clever, capable, lucky. He gave them that moment of glory and charged admission. He didn't invent deceit, he refined it. He showed that fraud thrives not where people are foolish, but where they are hopeful. In another life, with the same mind and voice, he might have built companies, written speeches, or led campaigns. But history rarely rewards those who can't resist their own performance. Imagine New York again at dawn. Ships glide toward the harbor. The skyline burns gold through the mist. On the docks, among the porters and vendors, stands a man in a modest suit, smiling. He holds a folder of papers, edges worn, seals shining. "Gentlemen," he says, "I have an opportunity for you. Maybe it's not a bridge anymore. Maybe it's a digital fortune, a miracle cure, a get-rich-quick plan. But the voice is the same, smooth, sincere, confident, and somewhere someone will still believe. Because the bridge was never the product. The bridge was us.